We're gonna. Okay, folks, we're gonna get started now. Welcome to the third panel of the day, assessing the media coverage of the Saddam trial. It's pretty exciting to be at this point in the day where media and outreach has been addressed in drips and drabs throughout, and hopefully with some of my comments beforehand and then the panel's comments, we'll be able to give sort of a lessons learned wrap-up of the media coverage and really assess where we are at. I sought to, before I prepared this today, I sought to get a sense of the perception, and I guess I should put a disclaimer here. All of my perceptions are going to be very Western-centric perceptions, which is something that I recognized in an email that Sharif recently sent when we were kicking around the draft document of our lessons learned. His response was, it's very Western-centric, and I thought to myself, how do I get past that? I don't know a way I can get past it other than to recognize as a disclaimer up front that the eyes that I'm looking through it from are Western-centric. So in any case, I went to find sort of get an idea of what the average American thinks of the tribunal, separate from the media accounts that we've seen in the news headlines and whatnot, because a lot of average Americans don't necessarily read the newspaper. So I went to see if there was some books out on the topic. Of course, there's one really good book, Saddam on Trial. It's on sale outside for $20. Feel free to get a copy. Another book that I found was a National Lampoon book parodizing the tribunal, which is sort of written in a Daily Show sort of light. And the other thing that I found was in a recent issue of Esquire, Saddam Hussein was voted the best-dressed defendant, and the quote below it was a quote that we've seen before, which was which was him saying, "Hey, look, I'm here, I'm the best-dressed defendant," or "Why don't we just get on with this thing?" which is sort of a sentiment that some people might be sharing. Why do I highlight these examples? I think they're important examples because they illustrate to us the imagery and the takeaways that the average person has from the trial. Most of them are not following the exciting issues that we saw at the debate earlier today about the particular procedural issues. They're just seeing the headlines and they're just seeing the snippets and the video clips. They're hearing terms like chaos in the courtroom. They're seeing underwear appearances where everyone decided they were going to show up to the courtroom in their underwear or their pajamas. They're hearing about out-of-control defendants. In short, I was referring to this with Michael when we were putting the book together as buffoonery. And that was really the type of stuff that was the takeaways, at least from the media coverage for me of the trial. Even on our book cover, what you'll see is Saddam Hussein standing in one of his famous temper tantrums, and Barzan behind him as like a backup singer. And it's sort of this chaotic perception. And I think the ambassador really struck at the heart of it when he said that when we talk about legitimacy, listen, this is a legitimate institution from a legal perspective, from an international law perspective, but what are our perceptions of legitimacy? And in a broader sense, how does that affect our views of how these types of tribunals affect the field of international criminal law? Frequent comments to the Grosh and Moment blog include things such as, why do you let him talk in grandstand, all the way to, why don't you drag him out in the street, shoot him, and get this thing over with so we can all move on. As international criminal law scholars, I think that this should concern us. It should trouble us, and it should highlight to us that outreach and media relations cannot be an afterthought in these types of tribunals. And that's sort of I think the perception that a lot of us involved with it are getting, is that outreach came afterwards and it wasn't involved throughout the drafting of the statute right on up through the beginning of the tribunal. And this has happened in other tribunals before as well. If you look at some of the scholarship written about the ICTR, there were some feelings there that the outreach took a little bit too long to spin up too. So one of the key takeaways for me, which I'm going to address here, is how do we make sure that when we're constructing these ad hoc tribunals, that we make outreach an integral part throughout the process, rather than having us go hide away in a corner somewhere, be lawyers, draft the document, and say, here it is. First, outreach matters because legitimacy matters. and the perceptions affect legitimacy. The legitimacy of tribunals, even those such as the Iraqi High Tribunal, a domestically constituted tribunal which applies international criminal law standards, matters because we seek to advance this field of international criminal justice. They also matter for the precedential effect. Like it or not, there may be some scholars who are going to try to Tokyo bomb the tribunal and say that the standards and precedents that are developed from this are more akin to the standards in the Tokyo tribunal and they shouldn't be given as much weight. But nonetheless, I think those precedents that we apply are going to matter, and perception of that is going to matter. And second, and perhaps most importantly, as Mr. Roth was pointing out before, is we can't let the procedural defects outshine the horrors and atrocities committed. We can't allow those to be lost in the sound bites and the outbursts and the chaotic video clips. We owe that to the victims, we owe it to the rule of law, and we owe it to the field of international criminal law. And I think that one of the big takeaways on that respect, again, is that if there's a perception that these tribunals are illegitimate, what future leaders will look at is they'll say, maybe I don't want to go down the path of pursuing justice against this individual because it's too messy, because there's too many political consequences, because there'll be these allegations from whomever that the process was not put together properly. So leaders will say, you know, maybe we'll just let the people drag him out into the street and have at him. And that's not the type of result that we want, and that doesn't advance the interests of the field of international criminal law. When Michael and I were putting the book together, we sort of discussed these issues, and this is sort of bringing it to an intro to the panel here, a little less broad. We were trying to figure out how to highlight this issue of the buffoonery taking precedence over the evidence. And the tribunal sort of did us a favor there. There was a turning point in March where all of the documentary evidence was entered in the trial. And this was really sort of a turning point for the tribunal and the prosecution as well, because this was when they started issuing some statements and talking points and doing press conferences. And what we saw here was a slight turn in the way the media was covering things because there was outreach and there was a recognition, if not explicitly, but implicitly, that gavel-to-gavel coverage was not enough. It was a long media stream of video, but there was no context that was put into. The prosecution wasn't necessarily doing as much outreach as they could have. So the lesson that we drew from that is that maybe this media outreach effort should continue. So first, as part of that, one of the key takeaways is the differences in the systems and the tribunals. The way they introduce the evidence in Iraq is this categorical way of presenting things, where we in the West might expect a chronological presentation of evidence. The evidence in the tribunal was actually entered in sort of categories of evidence. Here's our documentary evidence after we do a series of witnesses, and it didn't necessarily flow, but all of a sudden there's an explosion of information. We can probably expect the same thing to happen in ONFAL because there's a series of documents too. Also, with the defendant having a right to defend himself, to cross-examine the witnesses, that's the sound bites that oftentimes are taken away, where the defendant himself has the opportunity to question. It looks like an outburst, but what it actually is him exercising his right. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm going a little longer than I had hoped, but really the scope of the ONFAL campaign dwarfs the Dujail trial. So as we look to the future here on what we're going to be presented with for ONFAL, I think it's important to remember that the scope of the atrocities and the number of people that were killed under the regime. And as we embark on our scholarly analysis and media commentary on the ONFAL trial, it's my hope that we can build an outreach and media relations effort that doesn't allow the chaos in the courtroom to overshadow the witness testimony and documentary evidence. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to the panel to assess the media coverage of the tribunal. Thanks. Go ahead.
Well, first, since the C-SPAN cameras are off, we can let our hair down now?
Yes.
Yeah? You too, Chris. I'm a last-minute fill-in, so I don't have any prepared remarks, but I am prepared to remark about most things related to this issue. Basically, just two general broad observations, and I'll try to do a little bit of filling in. One is that we're missing context, not only with the Saddam trial, but with Iraq and the war, the broader war we're in. Context and perspective have been out the window, and I'll try to give a bit of context. Two, that I think the coverage and attitudes and views and positions vis-à-vis the Saddam trial are of a piece, it's been said before, but they're of a piece of the attitudes, positions, and views held towards Iraq, the liberation of Iraq, and the war we're in. And I don't think I'm hazarding a wild guess by estimating that at least 51% of the people here are opposed to our president, the administration, the liberation of Iraq, and the war we're in. So I think one follows the other. Now, back to context, just a few things. One piece I'm working on is called "Why Iraq? Let me count the ways." Let me count the whys. And let's remember, Saddam was the first person since Hitler to invade another country. Saddam was the first person since with Iran in 1980. First person since Hitler to take over another country 10 years later, gobbled up Kuwait. First person since the 1920s to use chemical weapons. And about the chemical weapons, I just looked up something. Jeffrey Goldberg of the New Yorker had a great piece about 5 years ago in which he went back to Halabja and not only did some forensic work, but also interviewed doctors from the Saddam military. Now, there were 50 towns and villages that were bombed in 87 and 88 with chemicals. And they bombed them with a cocktail of chemicals. Napalm, sarin, taboon, anthrax. And remember also, the anthrax that was used here was a finely milled military-grade anthrax, the last two to Senators Leahy and Daschle. A finely milled military-grade anthrax with silica gel that is only produced by 3 government laboratories in the world: Iraq's, United States, and Russia's. So the chemicals that were used in those 50 villages in 87 and 88, a mixture of chemicals, doctors from the military would follow in the wake of the bombings, and they would plot where the bombs fell, then the bodies, distances of the bodies from the bomb, and what the damage to each body was. What was the effect of them? Then they would go back to the laboratories and chart the data they collected. And as Christine Gosden, who was one of the forensic people working on it, she is a medical geneticist. She said, please understand, the Kurds were just for practice. And it's also worth noting, a lot of us are at war with our administration, our government. It is Secretary Shultz's denunciation of the chemical bombings in 1988 that caused that M5 campaign to stop. So Saddam invaded Iran, then 10 years later Saddam gobbled up Kuwait. First person since the 1920s, the gas chambers accepted to use chemical weapons since the 1920s. 2 genocidal campaigns, I'm sure you know about. One of them, whose case is coming up, the suppression of the southern uprisings, in their own words. Remember, I'm sure you all remember, after the liberation of Kuwait, people rose up in Iraq. They took over 14 out of the 18 provinces. We saw what happened in the north, in the Kurdish mountains, where the Kurds, where they dumped bags of powdered cement, and people were terrified because they thought it was chemical weapons, and Iraqi Kurdistan emptied. It was the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Mass exodus of biblical proportions. 3 to 4 billion people emptied their territory. We saw that. 1,000 people were dying on the mountains every day, and of course, President Mitterrand, whose wife was very involved in the Kurdish issue, and then Prime Minister Major impressed upon President Bush, and we created a safe haven. Now, we saw that. We didn't see what happened in southern Iraq. The Kurds had to do something. They were up in the mountains dying at 1,000 a day, so they negotiated with Saddam. We said, we can't live like this. During those negotiations, Mahmoud Othman, who was a Kurdish politician, he relayed back that Saddam's negotiators told him, it's a good thing you guys fled, because we would have done to you what we did in the south, and we killed 300,000 in the south. That's during the March uprisings. 2 genocidal campaigns. I'm sorry Kenneth Roth isn't here, because when I worked with Kenan Makia in the 90s, he wrote a seminal book on Iraq, Republic of Fear. And just a side about Republic of Fear, I grew up here in Cleveland. From the age of 9, I migrated from Baghdad with my family to Cleveland. I went to school here. My father was taking medical students from Case, so I went to school, and then my 2 sisters went to school at Case, and they founded the Arab Student Association here. That's a former life. And we were warned by our parents, if you hear an Iraqi accent, you cross the street. This is in the early 1980s, because a slip of the tongue, a wrong look, will get our relatives in Iraq in trouble. This was the fear that permeated Iraqis for 2-3 dozen years. Just some more facts. 2.3 million widows in Iraq. Well, I was going to say, with Kenneth Roth, when I was working with Ka'am McNeal, he wrote the seminal book on Iraq, Republic of Fear, and then I helped him with the book Cruelty and Silence. And then we set up a documentation project in Iraq. Andrew Whitley of Human Rights Watch and the guy I worked with, Ka'am McNeal, went to Kurdistan in November, discovered the Anfal campaign, and took out a lot of the documents. And I went to see Kenneth Roth. At the time, Iraq was the centerpiece of Human Rights Watch's work because of all the documentation. And there was a special rapporteur from the United Nations called Max van der Stoel, former Dutch foreign minister, right? Max van der Stoel, he came out with reports every 6 months, every year. He called the human rights violations in Iraq unprecedented since the Second World War. He also documented 5 cases of ecocide. The drying of the marshes, which is the biggest migratory created, well, let's go back in a little bit, go back in history first. Dumping of 500,000 gallons of petrol, burning of 700 plus oil wells, during the Anfal campaign, and the exclusion zone you talked about, Chris. This was a huge zone, and basically sort of deforested. I saw it when I went to 91 and 92. I visited the refugees of the Kurdish, the Turkey-Iraq border. Deforested, denuded the forests and the woods and the hills. Then, of course, drying the mine. Thank you. Then in the follow-up of the suppression of the southern uprising, we had the drying of the marshes, which is the biggest marsh waterlands in the region, an important migratory point. It's another ecocide that Max van der Stoel and others have pointed out. And Iraq used to be the biggest producer of dates in the world, but he destroyed most of the orchards, and a point of pride for Iraqis was also destroyed. So that's a bit of context, and I think I don't know if there's much more that needs to. Well, actually, one other little fact, which is sort of important. According to the documents and the testimony of former prisoners and former guards, in Saddam's prisons, they used to have 2 to 3 execution sessions a week. In each execution session, they would execute 4 to 5 people, which means that in each prison, each week, they would execute 8 to 15 people. Now, I recently discovered that there are 1,100 prisons and jails in Iraq. Now, let's suppose that it's in 10% of those that they were conducting such execution sessions. That would add up to, actually, I calculated for a quarter. Let's suppose it's a quarter. That would add up to 314 to 580 people executed a day during Saddam's reign. 2 to 5 million people that he's reportedly responsible for killing, estimates range between 2 and 5 million, puts him behind Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. Of course, Pol Pot's estimates are from 1 to 1.7 million, Idi Amin, 800,000 people. You know, there's some important context here, I think. And then just the reaction of Iraqis. A year ago, when the trial first started, and when you mentioned this today, Chris, about this first witness, even when you just said it now, my spine tingled that this guy said, you did this. And, you know, Iraqis were just incredulous. You know, here's the man who had them under his boot for 35 years, and suddenly now the word for, we use the defendant is al-muttaham, the accused, is the charged. Incredible that this guy who had his boot on our necks all over the world, not to mention there, where they couldn't breathe, and then suddenly he is accused of crimes. Iraqis were beside themselves. I remember here in Cleveland watching on television, a cousin's wife was watching too, and you know Saddam objected. He says, "Give me a chance," and she yelled out, "Did you ever give us a chance?" And on. There are so many examples. So I think that's just a bit of context, and you know, when I think the of a piece with our attitudes towards the trial, towards Saddam, towards Iraq, treating it as a joke, treating it as a sham. I think when we construct that concept in our heads that it's a circus, it's a sham, I think we also build those 3 rings and the carnival collars, and it's a real disgrace and a shame that people have done that.
Thank you, Iyad, Thank you for providing us that context. Simone, we'll go to you next. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. One of the things we often say in this world of international humanitarian law and war crimes prosecuting and defending is, and one thing we can all agree on is that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. And that's the essential question here, isn't it? 61 years ago, Justice Jackson, in his opening statement in the Nuremberg trial, said that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow, and to pass them a poison chalice is to put one to our own lips as well. And when you look at the coverage of the journalists and the analysts, I think that they asked the essential question. I think that they asked whether or not the chalice was poisoned, and I think they understood the historic importance of having a full record and a record that is seen by all. I think that on the whole, and I was quite surprised by this, much of the journalism was pretty good, better than I'd seen in other trials, in the Tadic trial, which was covered 10 years ago. And I think a lot of that was because organizations like CNN and BBC and New York Times and even Court TV availed themselves of experienced analysts like my blog brother, Mark Ellis, and Michael Scharf, who were able to bring that context to understand what was oftentimes very incomprehensible, poorly cadenced translations, and uncertain translations as well. So I think that that was a positive thing. You know, there was a lot of good coverage, but there were also some problems with the coverage of this trial. I think Michael Scharf in his blog mentioned that in October of, I guess it was October of 2005, you went to train some of the judges with the RCLO, and you raised to them the problems and the risks associated with having cameras in the courtroom. And I would say that to their credit. They didn't take much stock in that particular advice, although hopefully in all the other sage advice you gave, and allowed cameras to be in the courtroom. 10 years ago, when I was a much younger lawyer, I sat transfixed by the Dujail trial on my TV screen every day, and probably learned more watching that trial over the course of a year than I did in college or law school. And so I believe in cameras in the courtroom. I believe in the impact and power of the media and its use for good. But I also agree, as Michael warned the judges, that the media can also be a very negative and troublesome, meddlesome factor. In fact, prosecuting alleged genocidaires, well, convicted now, genocidaires in Rwanda, who, as Michael points out also in the blog, use the media to broadcast salacious and inflammatory and inaccurate information, wound up in a genocide which might have been a lot smaller, turning into a full conflagration that decimated a country within 100 days. And so I think, was the journalism responsible? Did it help understand what happened? Will it, in some measure, ensure that these kinds of crimes never happen again? I talked to somebody who is a lot wiser than I am before I came here. His name is Harold Burson, and Harold is probably one of the very few surviving journalists who covered the Nuremberg trial. He's about 85 years old, and some of you may know him from the word Burson Marsteller, which is one of the top PR agencies in the world. And he covered Nuremberg, and he said that actually he got the first interview with Justice Jackson during the trial, who actually gave an interview during the trial. And he said that they really believed that if the whole world saw these horrors for themselves, that these things would never happen again, that people would be educated. And in fact, the president's mission and the general's orders were that Germans should go into the concentration camps and clean them out themselves so that they could see what happened. Unfortunately, the more that we see these things on television, Tadic, this case or anything else, I don't think it's having any preventative effect. But I do think that many other good things are happening from the coverage. Now I just want to talk a little bit about some of the good aspects of coverage. But before I do, is there somebody who can give me some time warnings? Yeah? Okay, good, because otherwise I have no clue. Thank you. first thing. I think what was good about the coverage was that it was a lot more accurate and well-researched. Part of it, I think, had to do with the blog being available to journalists. I really do. I could tell that there were some things that they read on it on a regular basis from the background interviews they would have with us before we would give them print and media interviews. So I think that that was helpful, that they could sift out opposing views and then come to a better reasoned view when they were preparing the journalists. I think that something else that led to the better types of coverage were people like David Sheffer and Michael Scharf and Mark Ellis being employed to take these anchors through things that were very difficult. I think that a better understanding of these tribunals, better than people had at the time of Duško Tadić, was also helpful. And I think that as far as the problems were concerned, they were related to several factors, some of them avoidable and some of them inherent in the particular aspects of this case. I think one of the unnecessary things that happened was that a lot of journalists would oftentimes resort to viewing this trial through the prism of war rather than through the prism of a judicial proceeding, be it a bad judicial proceeding or a good one. It was a judicial proceeding. I'll give you one quick example of this. Last week, I think the judgment was adjourned, and it was supposed to be on October 16th, and an announcement was made. And 3 media agencies called me up on the same day asking me to give interviews. None of them were Court TV on that particular day. I don't know, maybe John Benet Ramsey or something was happening on Court TV. I don't know, but whatever it was. But 3 agencies called me, and what they wanted me to say was that the trial was adjourned because of fears of the insurgency. And so what I said to I said to all 3 of the agencies, it's quite normal for trials to be adjourned. I mean, the last case that I prosecuted to verdict in Rwanda took 241 days, and most of that was not straight through. There were adjournments, and judgments are often adjourned because judges are under enormous pressure to complete trials in a timely manner, and so they're overambitious, and they give themselves deadlines that they can't meet, or intervening forces come into play because something happens and they're unable to meet those deadlines. And I said to these journalists, well, how do you know that it's because of the insurgency? And after all, won't the insurgency still be around next month or the month after when the verdict comes out? 2 of the agencies canceled their stories because they were no longer interested in that kind of view, and didn't get anybody else either, and so maybe they realized it wasn't a big deal. And the other agency, instead of using the other explanations that I gave as possibilities in addition to the insurgency, only quoted me with regard to that particular aspect, that I said, yes, insurgency could come into play perhaps, but so too could other factors. So that prism of looking through it as everything is related to the war. The second thing is what you mentioned earlier, which is this Western Eurocentric prism that we're looking through. I mean, I'm giving analysis every day on Court TV for 35 days of the trial, I guess, or however many days it was, and I'm saying my view based on somebody who is working at an ad hoc tribunal and a mixed tribunal and who's an American of Iranian descent, but not an Iraqi person. I think that the network should have made a better effort as finding Iraqi lawyers to comment on these trials. And I think it could have been Iraqis who were in the diaspora who would certainly have a better idea if they could not find somebody in Iraq who was a lawyer to speak about it for some reason. So I think that that was also a problem. I think the other thing is that in the beginning there was a lot of coverage, and then the coverage kind of waned out. But when I talked to Harold Burson about Nuremberg, he said the same thing happened there. He said the first couple of weeks of trial, it was a full gallery like this, and each day less people showed up, less articles were written, and so that's only par for the course, I guess. People don't find these kinds of things very interesting. I asked Court TV what the ratings were, hoping, wow, maybe I added something to it, and it's better than Tadić. It's as bad as it was during Tadić. It didn't get any better. And they said, and we're still going to do it anyway, but we're not suicidal. We won't have a reporter in the courtroom every day like we did in Tadić. We realized to cut our losses as much as we could. But I do give Court TV and CNN International in particular a lot of credit for, despite losing money every single day that they put, maybe you on as well, I don't know, maybe you make them more money than I do on Court TV, but for going ahead and covering it anyway. And I think that that was really important. The audience is fickle. The audience wants to hear about John Benet Ramsey, but the audience also wants to relate to people. And in Tadić, there was easier capacity to relate to people because you could know a little bit about the lives of the prosecutors and the judges and the defense attorneys. It was hard to kind of pick a character you related to in the Saddam trial, and people want to relate to somebody. They want their Marsha Clark or, Johnny Cochran or Judge Ito to know and talk about. And I was always getting questions about, what is this judge really like? What is this prosecutor and defense attorney really like? And with the exception of Ramsey Clark and, like a bio from the blog about the judges, it was very hard to inform people about that. Another thing was the closed session. There's an enormous overuse of closed sessions in every kind of war crimes trial. We were guilty of it in the Rwandan tribunal. I believe that the Iraqis are also guilty of it in this tribunal. And really, a lot of things go on that you have no idea about in those tribunals during the closed session. And probably the most disturbing things happen in the closed sessions. And so it was very hard for the audience to relate to something when they weren't getting the full picture. The technical problems in quality, in sound, in feed, in translation, the uncertainty of the next court date didn't allow for continuity, that you couldn't see the witnesses' faces, that it was anticlimactic. We all know what the verdict is going to be, don't we? The time difference, having to wake up 4 o'clock in the morning and, to cover this every day and then go to your regular job didn't make it easy for me and other people, I'm sure, as well. And the cost is another issue. But I think some of the things that could have been avoided were just silly mistakes that were made. For example, the inquisitorial system. Everything was being talked about, like, is this normal? Is this abnormal? When if somebody just had a better understanding of what the inquisitorial system was, they might have understood a little bit better. I think another thing was they didn't understand, and unless analysts like Mark or David or Michael were able to explain it, that a lot of what happened in this trial happens in other courts as well. What people really want to see, as our moderator pointed out earlier, is this. This is what the viewers are interested in seeing. And it's not by coincidence that, the editors or publishers of this book chose this as the cover. Crazed Saddam in a historic moment raging against the court. That's what people want to see. And when you're showing them instead the mundane things that go on in a court every day, they're not going to be interested in looking at that. Finally, I just want to talk about the impact, because I have 2 minutes. And as far as the impact goes, somebody said something that really caught my interest earlier on. I think it might have been you, Chris, but if it wasn't somebody else, I'm sorry. They talked. Okay. Good move. Somebody was saying that, what can happen that's good out of this is that we can let people know that there will no longer be impunity, that you will be called to account for what you did. And that does have an effect, no doubt. I just want to leave you with something, a piece of evidence, authenticated evidence, that came out in our trial in Rwanda, where we tried 3 media executives for flaming genocide, and they were convicted. It's on appeal now. We found an audio tape from a radio station of Rwanda on July 1st, 1994, 14 days before the genocide stopped. And on RTLM, Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines, the journalists were saying this during the genocide. If we fight and win, nobody will try us because we will be considered triumphant warriors. But if we are defeated, they will do everything possible to fish us out, try us, and finally hang us, threatening to bring us before an international tribunal or whatever. There is a growing recognition that people will be called upon to pay for what they do, and that is important. But I think what is more important, if you want to get this word out, if you want to make a difference, if you want to have impact, is that you do outreach in the place where this is occurring. In Rwanda, we were hundreds of miles away, hours away, and years away from what happened, right? The trials occurred many years later. And people in Arusha, Tanzania, were not able to really know, people in Rwanda were not able to know what was going on in Arusha, Tanzania. We tried to fix that in Sierra Leone. The only problem was, as is the case with this Iraqi tribunal, the outreach for the prosecution started from the beginning. Outreach for the defense only came about bringing me in as principal defender in my case, and in the Iraqi case, whoever was brought in to head the defense office just before the trial began. There has to be equal playing field if there's going to be outreach. Otherwise, outreach can do more harm if it's one-sided. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all.
Thanks, Simone. And now Mark, please.
I'll pick up for a few minutes from what Simone was talking about at the last point about the media outreach. And I think this is, since we're looking at lessons learned generally for the trial, I think this was unfortunately another weakness, and one that I hope that in the future, at least domestic war crimes tribunals will get this right. And that's the lack of a objective media spokesperson for the tribunal. That was something that others, a number of us, urged the tribunal to undertake. RCLO would probably have a better insight on this, but it was really missing through the entire trial process, and because of that, it was confusing not only for the media, which was desperately trying to gain insight and information about just the basic things, about when the trial was going to take place, why it was closed, a closed session, but I think it was also confusing for Iraqi citizens as well. Oftentimes you would have the prosecutor speak, but he oftentimes was speaking in essence, on behalf of the court, which I think was a mistake. So that was one of the deficiencies, and I hope that, again, lessons learned in the future, that any domestic war crimes tribunal would invest into this important role of a media spokesperson that would come out. I come to this, of course, coming from London and living in London now for past 5 years, and so I've been fortunate, I think, to have had the opportunity during this particular time, because the media approach to coverage of the trial was drastically different in Europe versus what it was in the States. Now, I can't say that I was watching both accounts, but I do know that based on visits back to the States or discussions with colleagues here, there simply was not the coverage that was occurring in Europe, and particularly in London. Now, Simone had mentioned the involvement I've had with CNN International, and I think it's a fascinating court TV is there to do exactly what the court TV was doing, in the sense of following interesting cases, and I agree with Simone that it's a real investment. But CNN International did something I thought was extraordinary. They decided when they when the trial first started, that was where, and again, Simone talking about how exciting it was at the beginning, but of course that diminishes pretty quickly. But CNN International said it was going to do it something different, and it went and brought in two individuals. They brought David Sheffer, the ambassador of war crimes tribunals here in the United States, and for some reason they brought in me, and they split the time. And so I would start at 6 o'clock in the morning, London time, and David would come in. I would finish at 11, and David would pick it up here in the United States. Now, what was fascinating about it was that CNN International covered it every single day. Every single day I would be in that studio, and I suspect David was as well. And in most days they would have they would want some comment made on the trial. I would sit and watch the live feed that was coming from the trial, coming to the studio. CNN International hired an Iraqi citizen to actually translate the trial, even though the court itself had translation, but CNN needed its own. So he was also in the studio at the time. They also had a full-time reporter in Baghdad covering other aspects, but clearly spending a great deal of time covering the trial. Anish Rahman was one of the earlier, did a phenomenal job. But it was clear that they had decided that they were going to stick with this trial, and it was only when the war in Lebanon started that it dropped, and that was the one period of time that they generally didn't cover it. But for all of the other days, they did it time and time again. Now, BBC did the same thing, but not to the degree of CNN International. BBC would do it more a regular commentary, but not every single day. But BBC, you would expect them to have that type of focus on an issue like this, and sure enough, they did. But again, I think quite remarkable, quite impressive that CNN International did this. Now, what approach they took was at the first time they tried to do something, they brought in an Iraqi lawyer, and they brought me in at that time, and they wanted a debate. And so they wanted both of us to debate whatever issues they threw up. And it was an absolute disaster. I mean, it was just mind-boggling how bad that was. And I remember going back thinking, well, that certainly is the last time I'm going to appear in that show. But I think they learned a lesson. They decided what they wanted to do was to have some objective review of the trial process, something that Simone had mentioned earlier. And that became really the fundamental building block for CNN. What they were interested in was to try to educate the anchors first, and then the audience. So I'm sure as Simone did and as Michael has done and David Sheffer, part of the job was to sit with the anchors before they came on and to sit down and have a discussion about what they thought was important, what I thought was important during that day. And then if you're watching the live feed, if something interesting happened, it became to the point, because I had been doing it since last summer, that I would just go to the producer and say, actually, I think something is coming up that is of interest. And they got to the point where they would immediately then decide to cut in and cover a part of it. So they were relying pretty regularly, and I think in a pretty sufficient way, on me or others that they've had in there. And again, I thought that was quite impressive, and how they did that. Let me turn to the written press, which was something I want to end up with. Every day, I and others, certainly Michael, Simone, others, had to get a briefing. I had a briefing done for me every single day from the IBA office. I had somebody going through all of the press for that day's coverage and picking up anything that I might have missed. So by the next morning when they picked me up, I would know exactly what the issues were that were being sent out there from other observers. And here's what I noticed during the Dujail trial, and this is kind of my conclusions. One, for print media, there was a great deal of generalization made in the reporting on the trial. And when I say that, they would generalize and fairly consistently, they would generalize about human rights or justice groups, human rights activists questioning the fair trial, international human rights groups who say violence in Iraq make a fair trial impossible, etc. Never noting who the groups were, but just generally putting that out. And I'm not sure anyone would have caught that, except I was catching it because I was reading this day in and day out. And it became a pattern. And it was not a pattern consistent with one news report agency. It seemed to be quite broad. And it was a fascinating part of that. And then something remarkable happened. I was sitting this past year in about February of the year, and I came upon a quote. International human rights experts claim that the trial continues to be conducted well below international legal standards. Now, no notation about who the human rights experts are, but clearly stating that the trial is below international legal standards. That was February. And then as I was getting my briefing papers, I started seeing that quote time and time again. I saw it on March 1st. I saw it on March 22nd. I saw it on April 8th, April 26th. I saw that quote, the exact quote, used by the same agency or the same newspaper 10 times in a period of 4 months, just putting that in periodically, the exact same line. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that's the way to do these things. But again, a pattern that I'm not sure I wouldn't have caught, except I just kept seeing it be repeated and repeated. The other thing that I noticed in the print media is, and this gets back to the importance of having a media outreach program, getting the names right was an impossibility. Print names in the sense of defendants, judges, the inconsistency of the Iraqi names was so prevalent in the media press that it really became disturbing after a while, because you're thinking, well, this is supposed to be an objective, well-informed media trying to look at this, and they could never get the names right, and a judge's name would be spelled differently from one or the other, then the last name would be used when the first name would be used, and it just kept going on and on. They could not get the facts right. The number of times that I picked up the daily press, and I was looking at whether in Dujail there was 140 individuals who were killed in Dujail in the massacre, or 143, or 140. Again, I had a listing of about 8 different reports that they couldn't get something to me as fundamentally important as how many individuals were killed. And the last point for me was the difficulties in the media understanding. Simone had mentioned this earlier, the differences between common and civil law procedures. That was just perplexing to most reporters, and I think it biased and weakened their credibility when trying to report on the issues of the day in regards to the trial. And this is where I think it did help, and I certainly encouraged at CNN to really spend some time to try to understand these differences, because they're so fundamental, and if you're not accurate, you're not getting it right, and soon enough you're going to be painted with a broad brush of really not having the knowledge. But it was an area that I thought was a real issue. But again, to finish up where I started, I think many of these issues could have been resolved had there been a media spokesperson, and I hope that is a real lesson that's learned for future domestic war crimes courts. So that's my insight on that.
Thank you to the panel. It's interesting to see how the people in this room have, through the media and through blogs, served in a sort of a gap-filling role, really, for capacity issues, either for the tribunal or for the capacity issues for the media. We have 11 or 12 minutes for questions, so we have a bunch of time for you to engage the panel, and questions from upstairs if there are any. Go ahead, Chris.
Articles, and you were doing some analysis of them, so I thought I'd ask if you had the same impression as I did. You know, on some days you would have Saddam making an outburst, and the outburst included an important admission that might go towards his linkage or the command responsibility. And he would say something like, after hearing this terrible testimony about the condition in the prisons, and he said, "Of course I arrested the women and the children. I didn't want to break up the families. I'm like a father to my people," you know, and it's a big outburst. But most of the press just covered the outburst, but not the evidence that was coming in. And so you'd see these standard articles. There was almost a rote pattern. Chaos again in the Saddam Hussein trial. You know, Barzan yelled this, Saddam, you know, got up and got thrown out of the courtroom, and human rights experts say that this can't be a fair trial. And it would go on and on. Now, part of that, I think you can blame the lack of outreach. And like many other issues that have come up, there are a lot of things that you and the other human rights groups say, here was a failing, here's something. When you're on the ground working on these things, you consider those the challenges that you face that you're trying to deal with, and certainly one of them was trying to sort of get that outreach going, and we never really succeeded at it. And so part of it is there's a vacuum. But still, did you find that where you weren't seeing really compelling evidence in the newspaper articles and just sort of the outbursts, and why do you think that was going on?
Well, clearly in the print media, there seemed to be a much more focused on those outbursts, and certainly in the TV media there was. But this is, I think, the important role in the future for any individuals who are playing the roles that Michael and Simone and others have played, is to stick with the legal analysis of it. And I never tried to pretend or interfere with the reporter's approach, even if it was focusing on the outburst. I would try to bring it back in and say, well, what does that mean in context of the trial and international standards and in the burden of proof, for instance, admission. And I think that they caught on to that, and that was something that they appreciated, and I think that's the only role we can play. And I was, so as I hope I was this morning, I am oftentimes as critical towards the defense as I am towards the prosecution, as I am towards the court itself. I think the role that you have to play is a very balanced role, and stick with the legal issues.
There's a few questions up front, Brian. There's one.
I was hoping one of you could speak about the impact of televising the proceedings on the Iraqi people specifically. For example, whether you feel that their perceptions may have been negatively impacted by all the buffoonery, as Greg called it, being televised, or whether you feel that televising all these proceedings may have impacted their perceptions positively, like as to the legitimacy of the tribunal and justice being done.
How could it be negative?
How could it be?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, with all the buffoonery, as Greg called it, also being televised, whether, that may have impacted their perceptions.
Well, I mean, they're frustrated. Actually, a couple of other examples from watching television, Iraqi television and so on. They're frustrated with his outbursts and that he has a right. I remember during the first few weeks of the Dujail trial, people would call in to the television programs during the breaks, and, people would be very angry and say, we've got mass graves with little babies and holding their toys, and this guy gets an attorney, and this guy gets to speak. Tell him to shut up. And actually, another nice reaction, after Judge Rizgar was replaced by Rauf Rashid Abdul Rahim. You remember Judge Rizgar was a very mild-mannered. I know this was intended, and I thought he did a very good job. But Iraqis, were very frustrated with that. A few things coming to mind. Just as now they were very frustrated by Judge Abdullah al-Amri saying, never mind these name callings, forget dictator, you're not a dictator. That's very visceral for Iraq. This is a very serious matter. We treat it as, most of us treat it as a sham, as a circus. But it's very. So when Judge Rauf Rashid Abdul Rahman took over, and he told Saddam to sit down and be quiet. Iraqis were saying, now the trial has started. This is the real trial now. They want him humiliated. I took a poll of Iraqis. After Saddam was captured, I emailed and questioned about 140 Iraqis. And, what they want, in addition to wanting to eat him up alive with tweezers, which was done in the 91 uprising, mothers, widows, would actually eat some of the interrogators. They were thrown off the buildings from Slemaniya, 8th floor, the headquarters. And a friend of mine who's a dentist in Slemaniya, he saw this mother coming and eating this guy. She was so angry because she'd lost her husband and kids and so on. So Iraqis want to eat him, want to pick him with tweezers, torture him. A guy who works on the West Side Market, I know. He said, I want him to suffer like he suffered. I want to put razors in stuff razors down his throat. I want him to suffer how he made us suffer. But the general consensus sort of among Iraqis was, we want him toured around the country in a cage, and we throw tomatoes, we hurl insults at him, whatever. So they want him humiliated. That's the gut reaction, and they love seeing him on TV getting humiliated. Another case, I think, actually the first case, but you mentioned this guy coming up, and then also when Judge Rizgar told him to sit down. Okay, you don't want to say your name, all right, sit down. That was incredible. somebody telling Saddam, okay, have a seat then.
Simone, you had something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, my experience in the Rwandan tribunal and Sierra Leone tribunal really gives me an answer, if I can export that experience into how it might have affected people in Iraq, and that is that people in Rwanda were incensed when the accused was interrogating victims. People in Rwanda were incensed that they had bottled water, laptop computers at their table, and all this and that. The only way that you can do something about that is if you have, as Mark said, an outreach office, or you have somebody going and explaining they have computers because they have a right to a fair defense. They have bottled water because they have a right to it. They have HIV treatment because international law requires that they get it. Hopefully victims will get it too. Maybe they will, but there has to be that kind of outreach. There was a lot of outreach amongst us on the air, but I hope that next time, if there is a next time, that there's more outreach there. But you asked one question, which was, how did it affect the people there? One thing I know is that it does affect judges. The judges on the bench read the media. There's no doubt about it. And it makes them behave differently. In my trial in ICTR, one judge would comment during trial on articles that he read. And I think that that can affect the judge's behavior as well. So I think media has impact not only with the people, but with the judges.
We have, I want to get to some more questions. We have about 5 minutes left. Mike, you had a question or comment?
I just, purely anecdotally, but I was curious to hear how y'all would react. When last time I was there, I had a conversation with a guy from Hilla, an engineer, so an educated man, not, your common guy, but an engineer from Hilla told me, I asked him, I said, what are people saying in Hilla about the trial? And he said, many of them say, and I believe that it was a huge mistake to put it on television, but that it would be a bigger mistake to take it off now. And that's purely anecdotal, but I want to see, bounce that off of you and see your perception of that. In terms of the gap, I think there's a big gap between the Western coverage and the Arabic language coverage. And how do we fix that, you think?
And I'm going to ask for rapid-fire answers because I know there's some other questions.
The trial is really, what happens inside the trial is an imperfect metaphor for what's happening outside the trial. And so you have this division and this divisiveness, and I think it's important for the international community and for the court to stick with the trial and bringing justice to bear on Iraq.
There was an Iraqi delegation here last May or June, and they saw Professor Sharf, and they expressed some of the, that this guy just having a say, being able to speak, having his day in court was insulting. I mean, one of the guys who said his mother, whenever he appears on television, he goes, people are crying, his mother is agitated and angry, and of course they also see spikes of violence during the 2 appearances a week, and that Barzan, his half brother, is actually sending encoded messages to their followers. So they want him gone and hope that once he's gone, then the violence will ease. But they, I think there is greater wisdom among the members of the tribunal, and that one of the delegates also said, it would be much worse if it wasn't televised, and it would be much worse if there wasn't a trial too. As much as it might enervate them, frustrate them, feel that the victims are being wounded again, but it's still edifying. And
we probably have time for one more question. I know your hand was up for a while.
This question is for Mr. Mark Ellis. Usually, I heard a lot of courts here in the U.S., they don't allow cameras because we know people, they behave differently when there is media, and especially with such a high-profile court, people, they behave differently. So to serve justice, what do you think? Will it be better to be, of course, beyond this court, because it's already been televised? What do you think? Serving justice will be better to have televised or not? So we don't go through the O.J. Simpson, for example, court. Thank you.
The process of any trial is difficult, challenging. It can be chaotic, and certainly the Saddam trial personifies all of that. But in the end, I look for transparency. And for me, transparency in a case like this requires a TV and daily TV coverage. I think in the end, it will be considered to have been very important for Iraqis and for the international community at large.
Simone, we'll give you the last comment on that.
Basra, I just want to say it's a good question, but what I found out was in closed sessions, the accused act the same way that they do when the media is not there. They act even so much more obstreperous because the judges don't feel the pressure to stop them lest the international community get upset at the judges. And the only other thing I want to say is one thing, Court TV in particular, I think brought to bear about televising things that we need to focus on more, all of us, is that why do we allow genocides to happen? What was the international community doing and not doing? And we need to focus on the bigger picture, not just this trial, but ask all of ourselves, what can we do and what didn't we do? Not just how is this trial going along on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel. The final tour of the Bassioni archives is going to be beginning in a few minutes out this door here. Chris Chan will be leading it, so if you could head out there. Thank you.